Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. My name's Ed Bottoms. I run the AA Archives, and I'd just like to introduce our speaker tonight. We're very grateful to have Mohamed Elshahed here today to talk to us. Mohamed is an independent researcher, writer, and academic. He qualified as an architect at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, and then went on to do an MA in architectural studies at MIT, gaining a PhD at NYU in the Department of Middle East Studies. Alongside writing and teaching, Mohamed is also the curator of the British Museum's Modern Egypt project, where he's responsible for building a new collection of 20th century Egyptian material culture. Thinking about the lecture tonight, I was very conscious that within our own archive collections, we're all too aware really that our historic holdings relating to Egypt are very heavily biased towards material gathered primarily in the specific context of imperial exploration, when a number of AA graduates in the 1920s, 30s, and earlier became leading figures in the Egypt Exploration Society and worked as archaeologists, photographers, surveyors, etc., on many of the famous digs taking place in Luxor, Amarna, etc. And whilst we do have significant collections which address modernism in many different parts of the world, the archive is very silent on Egyptian modernism. And we hope today that you'll be able to bring out and talk about and address some of the issues and questions behind this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed, and thanks to the AA for inviting me. It's a huge honor for me to speak here today. So something happened in early 20th century Egypt where identity was being formulated and questions about what it means to look Egyptian and to be Egyptian and what it means to design as an Egyptian were quite important questions to ask. Somehow by the 1930s, most Egyptian cities, at least the downtowns of all cities, including provincial cities, had buildings that looked like this, which is maybe not what you would expect to see, in Egypt. The trigger for this was really 1919 when Egyptians revolted, a revolt that was driven by nationalist politics that was partially against British imperialism, and that revolt really questioned what it means to design an Egyptian object, to design an Egyptian home, to live an Egyptian life, and to be a modern Egyptian. What you're looking at is a cartoon from a later political revolutionary event. This is a 1953 cartoon that kind of depicts, I think, the aspirations of this utopianism that kind of comes immediately after a moment of revolt. So both after 1919 and after 1952, aspirations were quite high and questions about identity were quite wide open. And these manifested in many different ways, both in architecture, but also in terms of material culture and objects that people use in everyday life, and even in things such as fonts and typeface. What you're looking at, I think, is a nice illustration that encapsulates that how to say the word modern in two different languages, in English versus Arabic, and aesthetically really applied completely different notions and ideas. And some of these ideas, like I said, materialized into objects, some of which are now here in London as part of the Modern Egypt project at the British Museum. What you're looking at is an early typewriter that was commissioned by the Egyptian government sometime in the early 1920s. So again, immediately following the 1919 revolution. And it was commissioned to manufacturers in Syracuse, New York, called Smith Premier, who were essentially specialists in the making of typewriters for languages that are using different different typefaces and different fonts and different letters than Latin letters. So here is a machine that in a way encapsulates that moment, but as a sort of at the top of the scale. This is a state-commissioned machine, and so this is the way it presented itself, despite the fact that it's a machine made to mechanize the Arabic language. it identifies itself with this finely hand-painted gilded lettering. And so again, what you saw in that sign is, I would say, not a conflict, but in fact actually kind of a synthesis between different notions of what it means to be modern. And this manifested or translated into architecture in buildings that look like this. This is actually two villas that are interconnected into one building. That's what you see on the left for two sisters. What you see on the right is a residential building in downtown Cairo that was built, or that was commissioned by the governor in Alexandria as his property in Cairo. And here you see another villa in the district of Heliopolis, which you can tell was on the outskirts of the city, quite empty around it, again by two sisters. Interestingly, today only half of it is existent, and it's turned into a hair salon, I believe, while the other half has been torn down by the inheritors of the other person, and it's a tall tower directly attached to the building. And again, here's another example from Heliopolis. And I think it's important at this point to actually point out that all of the buildings that you just saw, except for the building commissioned by the Alexandria governor, no longer exist. And not only do they no longer exist, they're also not really documented, with the exception of the few photographs that we have of them published in magazines at the time. The architectural profession in Egypt has very early roots. It starts really to take shape in the beginning of the 19th century with Muhammad Ali coming to Egypt and building a new nation. And in the beginning, it was purely about military, and it was purely about facilities that are necessary for the military. And later on in the 19th century, European expertise played a big role in the development of the profession, mostly serving state commissions, but also elites in the form of palaces and palace grounds and so on. But something happens in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century. 1897, for example, was a huge building boom. Cairo was a kind of Dubai of its time, and a lot of development and building activities were taking place. Most of this was still dominated by European architects, and when I say Europeans, I'm mostly speaking about Italians, French, with some English as well, and Austrians. However, again, because of the 1919 revolt, this really transforms, and you have the founding of a new class of Egyptian architects, both men and women, mostly men, of course, as happens at the time. And this is what you see here, for example, is architecture students in 1949, a bit later, building an architectural model of the export grounds in Cairo, which have later become sort of the heart of Egypt's Ministry of Culture, and today this is where the Opera House is located. And what's really important here is to note that we're not talking about individual cases of Egyptian architects rising after this moment. We're talking about an entire transformation of the profession where the main players are all Egyptian. And here are some of the prominent names. It's difficult to create a full roster of who was really active. Again, part of the lack of documentation and study that this history has received. Only the really, let's say, the top of the list is known because of their building activities and because their names are documented sometimes on the buildings themselves in the form of plaques. I'll quickly introduce a few of those, the ones highlighted. Let's just look at Antoine Selim Nahas. This is him at the Fine Arts School in Zamalek, and the Bahiri buildings named after buildings are often named in Cairo after the person who commissioned them. So they're twin buildings right on Tahrir Square today, built in 1934. And then this is another building that he built further northwest, commissioned by a woman named Inji Zeda in 1937, and you can tell these are quite architecturally different buildings. And this is something really important to note here, that architects did not necessarily, because what we're used to, what we're usually taught about, let's say European modernists, is that they had a very distinct architectural style that they implemented, or there's a particular growth and evolution in their aesthetic that's somehow continuous. And I think what's strikingly different here is that while architects had a lot of their own ideas that they were loyal to, they were also quite flexible to really essentially work for the person that's commissioning the property. So the same architect within the range of 3 years can create both of these buildings. Another prominent name is Mahmoud Riyad. Mahmoud Riyad was quite an important figure, not only because he was a very active architect, but he also served the state in many offices. He was at one point the head of the municipality, and he built a lot of buildings that were for large insurance companies and banks, for example. And what you're looking at here is an example on Talat Harb Street in downtown Cairo, again, completed in 1952. And there you see him with Kulthum, the leading singer of the time. One of his most prominent buildings is the Arab League, again on Tahrir Square, completed in 1958, which again, from a modernist history point of view, as we know it, this kind of fits multiple categories. If you zoom in and you look at the portal, the main gate, it's quite decorated with Moorish patterns, which you wouldn't think are necessarily what would be considered sort of mainstream modernist at the time in the 1950s. So it's a building that sort of has the essence of a building like the UN, where there's a secretariat tower, there is a main conference hall, and then there is sort of offices for different kinds of staff in a separate wing with a grand entrance. So it has that kind of, let's say, party or that kind of diagram, but it looks quite different when you look at its details. Ali Rabr is another important architect of the period. He was also the dean of the School of Architecture at Cairo University for quite a long time. And he was the architect that built the house of Kulthum in a location that today is still remembered as, Kulthum. When you ride a taxi in Cairo and when you say I want to go to Kulthum, everybody knows this is the spot, despite the fact that the house no longer exists. And as you can see, there are several features in the house, quite streamlined, modern, lots of curvy lines, lots of influence of binautical architecture, but the interior is really quite lavish in terms of, it's minimal, yet it's quite traditional in many ways, and the furniture would not be called modernist by any stretch if we were looking at it in this context. So again, this could be seen, like I was saying about the font, as some sort of conflict or inconsistency, but in fact I just see it as another definition or another reading of what it means to design and to build something that is explicitly called modern at the time. And again, the same architect can build a house for the most famous and important singer at the time, but he can also design housing projects for railway workers. And that kind of versatility is important to note. This is the Bank Misr textile industrial complex that he designed in Mahalla Kubra, which remains until today, and it's quite a landmark site. Sharla Ayrut is another interesting player in this field. His buildings are particularly, they stand out for his curves that you see in the balconies, again, which is something that you would see from the period. So this is not necessarily what I always want to remind people is when I talk about modernism in Egypt, I'm not trying to show you something that you've never seen before. In fact, I'm trying to show you something that you should be able to relate to what's really happening in the rest of the world in terms of what architects are doing, their details, their ideas, and sometimes the way they make mistakes by combining things that you would think don't go together. Here's someone that uses exposed, he uses brick as a kind of veneer, which you wouldn't think is necessarily something you should do if you're, pure modernist, yet he also combines it with these rounded balconies. And the entrances in all these buildings are really quite grand, and they take the scale of really 19th century kind of apartment blocks. So these are not modernist entrances that are, constricted in terms of space with tight stairs. The stairs and the entrances in Cairo's buildings from the period, despite these kinds of facades, are really quite open and lavish. Naum Shabib is quite different in the sense that he really saw himself first and foremost as an engineer before as an architect. He was a specialist in really in concrete and used it as his Play-Doh. And this is one of the examples of his churches. They were all quite playful in terms of form, lots of focus and form. And you can see it in another example here in Port Said. So again, not limited to Cairo alone. But his buildings, as you can see, are not necessarily all following a particular style, but they all use concrete or stretch the ways in which concrete can be used, at least as technologies were available in Cairo. This building in the middle is the first tall residential building. It's 22 floors in 1954 Cairo, which was quite exceptional. It's still quite tall today in the context of downtown Cairo. And then Al-Ahram headquarters, completed in 1968, consists of 2 volumes with quite a lot of high-tension concrete in the structure as well. And so all these buildings were really done by a community of architects that belonged to an active profession that not only built, but also engaged in professional conferences that were often regional. So here, for example, is the Egyptian delegation at the Arab Engineering Conference that was held in Damascus in 1946. The first one is 1945, immediately after the war, that was held in Cairo. And the idea was that engineers and architects can really partake, now that the war has ended, can really partake in the building of a new Middle East. And this is hence the sort of the focus on the region. The third conference was done in Beirut, and so on. So not only did these architects meet, build, but they also published quite extensively. This is just an example of one of the magazines produced at the time, and many of these are one-offs. You know, somebody wants to try a new publishing entity, and it doesn't work out. So we end up finding in the markets today, as I sort of try to do my research, lots of these one-offs. But really, there's others that have quite a long history, including this one that I'll mention. I'll speak a bit more about it in a few minutes. Majallat al-Amara, which was established in 1939, and it lasted until 1959. And so, I guess before going forward, the question is really, how did this architectural aesthetic become so dominant and so prominent in the Egyptian context, despite the lack of sort of the rise of a heroic figure that, something like Le Corbusier or so on, that sort of is known as the Egyptian modernist. The short answer is that this was really a real estate-driven profession, and that the aspiration was not about being avant-garde as much as it was about, using modern materials and technologies available in Egypt at the time in the most that they can, in their sort of purest form. So there was quite a huge rejection between what these architects were doing towards what European architects were doing before, which was largely neoclassical inspired and very much facade oriented. And you see this really quite clearly in the advertising at the time. It's all about materials, it's all about concrete, it's all about the introduction of steel into the marketplace, it's about the introduction of glass, in certain ways, whether it's sheets, large sheets for windows, or just different kinds of materials. So really it's material driven based on availability in this particular context. But this interest to sort of design new, modern, but also useful things was not limited to space and architecture. It also went into object design and furniture. And so, for example, Ideal was quite a prominent company that was all about creating modern furniture out of metal for households, and later on expanded to serve offices and even government offices. Unfortunately, the really beautiful factory building was just demolished 2 weeks ago for absolutely no reason. It could have been, a cultural center or a co-working space for designers and artists. I'm not sure. There could have been many options, many ways to utilize the building and to revive this history of this company that really was in every household and every government office for a good, 30, 40 years. And today, very few people would remember this. And that was not unique. Many companies were doing the same. But this also goes into graphic design that was obviously most visible in terms of advertising. And you can see here, again, this is an ad for cement tiles. Really, this is what you see, the materials. And not only that, there were also exhibitions about the materials. So this is an exhibition by a nationally owned concrete company, a cement company, again showcasing the new material and how it's available in the market, on the market in Egypt, and what sort of the company can offer in terms of how people can build and design structures. And so what I'm trying to say here is that architects, in a way, found themselves as the figures, the lead figures that can mobilize and move these developments and also serve a marketplace that's seeking both buildings and items and objects to populate these buildings. So going back to Al Amara magazine, which had I think a long, consistent run for 20 years. Sometimes the publication was interrupted. For example, during World War II, when there was a shortage of paper, the issues were less, they were skinnier. But it lasted for a good 20 years. And the founder of the magazine is Sayyid Karim, who I would say is the closest person that one can call as sort of let's say the mobilizer or the head of a movement. And this is actually another important point, is that part, I think, of the sort of dismissal of what happens in places like Egypt is that, the lack of a heroic figure that comes out with a manifesto that says, this is what the future should look like. Sayyid Karim wasn't necessarily trying to do that. He wasn't trying to change the world. However, he was trying to preach to the local audience to say that what we've been seeing in our cities is a problem in terms of its design, and what the government should do is to actually play a bigger role in implementing materials and using materials to build architecture that serves the people. But also, he's not a socialist in any way, although he does publish later on something called the Socialist Villa, and I'll mention this briefly. It sounds again like another inconsistency. But I mean, he's somebody that was willing to cater to all classes. But of course, at the end of the day, he was the son of a pasha, a really upper class person. His grandfather was the Minister of Public Works. He's quite a privileged man who got his PhD in ETH in Zurich. So, while he spoke of modernist architecture in the Egyptian context as a vehicle for progress and moving forward to sort of satisfy the needs of society at large, at the end of the day, most of his buildings were really catering to the bourgeoisie and to the state. But that does not, I think, dismiss the importance of his ideas, and also to see them in the particular context in which he was working. Both of these buildings, again in downtown Cairo, were completed between 1948 and 1950. I mean, for example, let's take the building on the left. It's a multi-function, multi-use building. It includes obviously commercial space on the front, on the street level. There are office spaces, and then there are serviced rooms, kind of like serviced apartments above, and then that volumetric sort of that volume on top is a villa for the owner, Madame Ozonian. There's something for everybody, So, and then the other building was commissioned by an insurance company, Alexander Insurance Company, and it's again mostly apartments, including some duplexes. And the step back that you see was part of laws that were implemented after World War II. Kind of again what was happening in many other places in the world. Step back laws, are quite common at the time. But he also built, like I said, for the state, and that actually kind of came back to hurt him later on. This is the headquarters of the Arab Socialist Union, which is in Heliopolis. And he has many proposed but unrealized projects, such as this church in Maadi. You can see a lot of, someone like Oskar Niemeyer in this. But Oskar Niemeyer himself was until the early 50s totally dismissed. Until an exhibition was done in MoMA. The Brazilian modernism itself was dismissed. And also, what's really important to mention here is that Sayyid Karim was in conversation with Brazilian modernists more so than he was, let's say, with what was going on in the US or with what was going on in Europe. An entire issue in 1952 of his magazine was dedicated purely to Brazil. And he also published books. So we're talking about a very active person. This is his most, I would say, comprehensive and important book. It's called The Socialist Villa, which an interesting idea that really takes root in somebody who comes from quite an upper class setting, an education both in Egypt and in Europe, that thinks a modern person and a modern family should live a certain lifestyle in a certain kind of space, like a villa, and then trying to translate this into a building typology that really could potentially be used for, again, all classes. It failed as an idea, but nonetheless, many theories that we study in school have failed, but we still study them. So we can add one more to them. And here are some examples from the book. Just put in straight pages here. His aspirations stretched way beyond the borders of Egypt. This is a project for Baghdad in 1946. This is another one for Halwan, which is south of Cairo. So each one of these 2-floor strips is composed of duplexes. So all the apartments are 2 floors, small square footage, but 2 floors. I think he was just in love with having internal stairs in your living space. And this is from 1947. This is a workers' housing. I believe it was in Suez for oil workers. And then this is another model for New Damascus, 1948. And this is the building you had just seen previously. So in addition to publishing extensively and to building extensively, he also was thinking, in larger ideas that were mostly in sort of responses to trends and ideas that were happening at the time, metabolism. So, there is no commitment to one kind of idea. This is clearly influenced by metabolism, and it's an urban kind of a model that takes this as its unit. So the idea is to replicate this in this fashion so that you can essentially build a city that can extend forever as much as or as big as you need it. None of this is published. I found all of this is in his archives, which were deposited by his family at the American University in Cairo. And again, these were unpublished designs and models for Nasser City, which he eventually was commissioned by the government under the Nasser regime in the late 50s to design. And in fact, Nasser City is a notorious part of Cairo. Anybody that's been to Cairo, Egyptians tend to say that they don't like it, mostly because of its modernist layout, but also because the project was never implemented fully the way he envisioned it. Because of economic issues and so on, and also because of his relationship souring between him and the state. The project continued and was implemented in quite a haphazard way. What was really implemented from his idea is the stadium, which is the first thing that got built, and then the first set of buildings in the square immediately next to it, which also involves ministerial towers for various ministries. Some of the housing models that he developed, such as this one, were in fact implemented in parts of the city, not in the plan that he initially wanted, but the model is nonetheless extant today, and it looks like this. This is what it looked like when it was immediately completed. And I think what's really fascinating about this group of architects and this moment is, while it's not really a movement in the sense that it doesn't have particular philosophical ideas that it's trying to sort of implement, they were very careful to publish their own history really quite early on. So Tawfiq Abdelgawad was a very close friend to Sayyid Karim, and he publishes a book called Egypt in the 20th Century, or Architecture in Egypt in the 20th Century. This is done in 1989. In 1989, somebody's already realizing that this moment had passed, and that it was time to put it on paper and to document it. He also was publishing sort of, let's say, books for future generations of architects with tenets and ideas that they should consider and think about. And you can see on the cover is a design by Sayyid Karim for Venezuela, for a city in Venezuela that was obviously never implemented. And not only that, there were others who were translating iconic architects, the works and ideas of iconic architects from around the world. So this is a book about Le Corbusier. So again, this is done in the 80s. This is another book about Le Corbusier from Mohamed Elshahed, who is actually the assistant editor of Al Imara magazine with Sayyid Karim. So what I'm trying to show you in a very brief way, just 1 second, is that not only were these architects really quite active in terms of supplying the market in Egypt with the real estate that it desires, but also are very invested in generating a knowledge about architecture and modernist design in the Arabic language that has been spread throughout the Arab world since. So the ways in which Le Corbusier enters the Arab world were mostly through Cairo, through these architects, and then their translations, their readings of Le Corbusier is what ended up traveling to Baghdad and Syria. Influencing a whole generation essentially to continue such ideas, both a combination of, yes, imported ideas, and ideas do transfer, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. If anybody still claims that ideas are pure and they're sort of the product of genius, I think they're missing something. Transfer in fact happens, influence happens, it happens both ways, and recognizing that it is actually essential. And I think it's to the credit of architects and artists that actually name who they were influenced by, as opposed to deny it in order to sort of present themselves as geniuses. So the fact that an architect like Abu Bakr Khairat or Sayyid Karim himself in some of his later buildings, this is called the Zamalek Tower, which I should also note was a period of Sayyid Karim's practice where he was collaborating consistently with an artist, a sculptor named Mahmoud, I'm blanking out. I blanked out on his name. But you can see the artwork on the facade. And again, a slew of other architects were influenced by these ideas, both the ones implemented on the ground and the ones translated from masters abroad. These are just some more of Sayyid Karim's buildings that were published quite early on in order to make them accessible to architects across the Arab world. And you can see the influence in really across the region, for example, in Kuwait, in the Gulf, in many of the new cities in Saudi Arabia at the time. These were the ideas that were the first reference point before bringing in an architect from the US or from somewhere else. And in fact, someone like Sayyid Karim himself traveled to the Gulf when his marketplace really started to shrink in Egypt. And one of the examples is really this building, which was proposed in the early 60s to be a culture palace for the city of Mansoura, was never implemented, but 20 years later it was built in Kuwait as a cinema. This is another one of his sort of conceptual projects that are very much in tune, particularly with Le Corbusier, who Sayyid Karim openly celebrated. And this was in fact implemented. It's a partially implemented. It's a 3-block complex that, guess what, like Le Corbusier, includes a commercial street within the building, a street that would have the shops, and all of the 3 buildings would be connected by one podium. What was implemented later on are the 2 furthest towers, not the round one, and the podium that connects them was not ever realized. Mohamed Elshahed, like I said, who's worked with Karim, also went on to propose conceptual ideas about architecture and how they could serve the transforming and changing Egyptian context. After the revolution of 52, the need for housing was really quite a big problem. There was a huge demand for housing, and I think this is really the tipping point when the state failed to supply not only enough spaces, but also really to provide opportunities for others to implement solutions for housing. This is when the informal sort of really creeps into Egyptian cities and has since dominated. And so what's important to keep, so basically Sayyid Karim is my guy. He's for me the leader of, the closest thing that one can call as a leader of this group of people that I've just talked about. I think again it's really important to mention his relationship to the state. This is him explaining or showcasing an architectural model for another design for the Mansoura Culture Palace to the Minister of Culture in 1960, which looks like this, a little bit more subdued from the previous model. And again, this is the same idea that you see in the first model implemented here and in a different way for Asyut, another province, and again was never implemented. And then this is an unrealized hotel and casino combo that was done in 1955. On the edge of downtown Cairo, and again was not implemented. What's really important for me to mention here is that I'm showing you all this at the end about the relationship between this architect and the state is the relationship soured, and Sayyid Karim spent the last 4 decades of his life under house arrest. But his house wasn't so bad. It was really quite, it's really quite nice. One of my dreams is actually to, the family still owns it and they don't live in it, and they're very open and willing to the idea of transforming it into some sort of cultural center focused on the life of Sayyid Karim, with perhaps an exhibition space and an archive and so on. So if somebody out there wants to make this happen, let me know. But the relationship between architecture and politics was not new. Sayyid Karim was not the first sort of to break that barrier. It happened in different ways previously. So for example, this is the Egypt's central bank as it was built during colonial times, British colonial times. And when British troops were demanded to leave Egyptian cities, one of the first things that were done is actually to renovate the building and transform its design. So I think it's really quite an important example to keep in mind, the fact that one of the first acts by the state immediately after the, let's say, the eviction or the withdrawal of British troops from Egyptian cities was to go to the central bank, which is really the symbol of why the British were in Egypt in the first place. It was about the banking system, it was about the economy, it was about money. And as soon as they left in 1947 Egyptian cities to be limited to the Suez Canal zone, the building is transformed into a modernist one with an added floor, a clear, simple facade, different materials, but the building remained. It was not demolished. It wasn't a new building. It was a renovation. It was a kind of a facelift. It was the announcement of a new era. And you see this again after 1952 with the Nasser regime, where the Cairo Tower is the most notable example of this, where the rumor is that it was built with a gift by the Americans to sway Egypt in the Cold War, and instead we got this monument. So politics and architecture, particularly in this kind of direction, modernist design. And this is by Naum Shabib, again, the engineer, architect that I mentioned earlier. So how does Egypt figure in the history of modernism? And I think I'll just start, I'll answer this with a very recent article in The Guardian, in one of Britain's newspapers, where Jonathan Jones, I've never heard of him before, but apparently everybody knows him, said in relation to the Egyptian Surrealism exhibition that's currently at the Tate Modern, he said that Egyptian Surrealists cringed before the might of Paris, as artists and writers did all over the world at the time. Why should we look at second-rate imitations of a modern French style when we could be contemplating a majestically beautiful mimbar carved in Cairo in the 15th century? And I just hear like Aladdin music in the background. Essentially what Jonathan Jones is saying is that, modernism has a center, is a very clear center. It's Paris in this case in reference to Surrealism, and that everything else is a knockoff. It's a second-rate copy. And I must say that, I've been, interested in modernism in Egypt, particularly architecture, for most of my adult life after school. So every single time that I give a presentation in a Western setting, but the first question is, and why is this important? It looks like a knockoff of Le Corbusier. And this does happen. And I think really the roots of this is quite really outdated ideas about the history of art and the history of modernism in particular, that really can be traced, for example, to something called the Fletcher tree of architecture, which was quite, relevant until not that long ago, until the 1970s. It was in some textbooks, and it has many variations. This is a particular version from 1954, and what the tree of architecture really symbolizes is that, taking the root or the diagram of a tree to say essentially that there are dead branches that emerge out of a tree, they stop, they become irrelevant over time, and it's the bark of the tree, which is of course Greek, Romanesque, And in this particular version, it's American with the flat iron at the top, because it's 1954, that's still seen as the pinnacle of architecture and design. And everything else goes to I think there's like Egyptian, one of the dead trees down here in the first row, along with Assyrian, Peruvian, and Mexican, and Indian, and so on. This was taught in architecture schools, in some architecture schools as late as the 70s, and maybe even the 80s. So it's no surprise that to a Western audience, a well-educated Western audience, the perception is we own this thing, we own progress and modernity in its manifestations in terms of architecture and design as one of the outcomes of this. And therefore, when we see someone, let's say Karim, we just think of Le Corbusier and we say, well, why should I care? And the reason I say you should care is because there's local history, and history has specificity. In the Egyptian context, someone, let's say Karim, and all of the other architects that I've spoken about, come out of a really real national struggle about national identity that again goes back to the 1919 revolution. In this particular case, I show you here an example of a proposal for the Egyptian exhibition in the 1939 exposition in New York. And guess what? It looks like an ancient Egyptian, yet futurist kind of building, exhibition hall. And it was done by the architect Mustafa Fahmi, who was the architect of the palace at the time, who built quite monumental and stately buildings all across the capital, including the mausoleum for Saad Zaghloul, who was the political leader of the 1919 revolution. So at that moment, in the 1920s, in the first decade after the 1919 revolution, this was one of the answers as to how to create an Egyptian identity that's still modern. And it was to take direct reference from ancient Egypt in order to create a new kind of building typology. And this again translated into art. It wasn't limited to architecture. And there were, like the surrealists that Jonathan Jones dismisses, whom you see here in this picture, there were other voices that did not approve of this approach of pulling out of the bag of history and piecing together a new kind of style. For them, it was moving forward, being progressive, thinking in sort of simple terms. And I'm not saying that this is something that the group particularly embraced, but this is happening at the same time. This is 1939. So the same time that this is being built, this is also being sold to the middle class. So realities are really happening at the same time. They're concurrent. There isn't one direction or one pure sort of line of progress that happens in any place at any given moment. And I think it's really important to accept this in the Egyptian context, just like you should accept it in the British context, just like you should accept it in any context, in fact, is that there are constantly multiple realities and multiple approaches to answering really core questions, which is how do we as a society want to build, how do we want to represent ourselves, whether in our fashion or in our architecture. I say fashion because here's an example of a department store that uses architecture as its logo. The emblem of being modern, where you go buy your pajamas, is the building. Specifically that kind of building. So what is the fate of modernism or modern design in Egypt today? And I put this question on a background photo of the Royal Geographic Society from 1925, because I couldn't find, there is no photograph of another event in which Sayyid Karim spoke in the presence of the king at the Royal Geographic Society in 1933, where he essentially makes those ideas almost very legible, the ideas that we should move away from this referential hodgepodge approach to designing modern national identity by actually embracing a modernist design approach. And obviously this is not what happened. But I want to use this sort of part of the talk to show you how ideas about design really surpassed the monuments. It surpassed the real estate driven boom. It was also in the everyday, it was in simple things like insect sprayers. If you look at the container of this insect sprayer, which would be something clearly not to be placed in a museum in Egypt today, however, it does tell us quite interesting and complex histories about what it was like to design a product as mundane as an insect sprayer in 1920s, 1930s Egypt. Look at the font design. Have you seen, that kind of care given to writing the name of a brand that is really there to kill cockroaches? There is something really quite deep in terms of translating those ideas beyond monuments, but also to how to sort of include them into the everyday. Here's a very sleek machine designed and built in Egypt in 1954, a sewing machine built by the military factories that were established after 1952 to sort of, well, they existed pre-52, but after 52 they also produced household items. And design is an integral part of this machine because it had to be marketed and it had to be appealing to households and to women particularly all across the country. And so again, this calendar, as maybe let's say not important as it may seem, it records on it a building that was built after 1956 when the city of Port Said was bombed by the Israelis, British, and French. And when the government decided to rebuild the station, it was in this particular style. And not only that, its image was circulated widely in things like calendars, postal stamps, postcards, so that if you can't make it to Port Said to see what the state has done to rebuild and how it implemented this modernist design, you can at least have it in your household hanging as a calendar on your kitchen wall. And again, here's the Arab League building that we've seen in another model picture with members of the office of Mahmoud Riyad. And what I'm trying to say is that the image of architecture was the image of modernist architecture was equally as important as the architecture itself. It was on things like calendars, postal stamps, and postcards, and cigarette boxes. And this is, a striking example in which what we saw as this early definition of what it means to be modern in Egyptian that emerged in the 1910s, 1920s with direct reference to ancient Egypt, the same item on the back of it depicts a modern scene with contemporary buildings. So again, concurrent, happening at the same time, sometimes on the very same object, because these identities are not conflicting. What we're usually taught in architecture school is that there's traditional and then there is modern and there's somehow a journey traveled in between. And what I'm trying to say through some of these images and some of these objects is that oftentimes these things happened quite at the same time. Exhibitions, this is, I showed you the illustration of the design for the exhibition in New York in 1939. This was the Egyptian exhibition in New York in 1964. Again, you can see how the same architectural ideas were implemented and adopted fully by the state. And I don't know if you can make it out, but under the middle arch, there is an ancient Egyptian statue. So again, the ancient, the traditional, the ancient, and the modern are sort of happening concurrently. And this is an idea that you see all throughout. So if you keep that in mind and you revisit the entire history, you'll see that this has always been there. This is, again, from the 1949 expo for Egypt, the Industrial Agricultural Exhibition. This cover from you, again, depicts this idea where you have traditional woman with traditional dress, traditional jewelry showcasing, in fact, what was the pinnacle of modernist design in terms of what the state was building at the time, which is the grounds of the exhibition itself. However, today, what remains of these buildings is either neglected, mostly unknown, they're not studied, they're not, the identity of the builders is not known. A lot of them have changed ownership so many times that sort of the true owner is lost, and so they just sit around until they decay entirely. Decay entirely is in the best scenario. The other scenario is that they actually just actively get demolished. This is an Auguste Perret building in Alexandria, someone whose buildings are not only national heritage in France, but they're essentially kind of UNESCO World Heritage status. And one of his early works was in Alexandria, and it was demolished only 2 years ago, even though it was in perfect condition. Precisely because this whole history that I've tried to give you a quick snapshot of is not considered heritage, is not considered important, and a lot of this is influenced by ideas such as those voiced by Jonathan Jones. When people in those kinds of places accept the narrative that someone like Jonathan Jones is actually portraying, they also believe it. And then the whole 20th century disappears. It's no longer something to be studied and documented, and this is what happens. So, sort of to conclude, what I tried to do here is to give you a bit of a snapshot of this history, but also to not end on a negative note. I want to sort of showcase, I guess, a couple of things that I've been trying to do to mend the situation, I suppose. One is to try to resurrect the history of Egyptian modernist design, to find and organize contemporary designers, because in many ways what someone like Said Karim was concerned with was not only about modernist design as it was happening at the time, but it's really about the organization of an entire profession of makers, publishing for them, creating conferences for them. So he was really invested in his contemporary moment. And I think it's really important to do the same today. And I think part of that is also to build an audience for architecture and design. So quickly, I'll just show a couple of recent things I did. This is an exhibition that was done in Dubai Design Week in 2016. The exhibition was the first of its kind in the sense that it gathered 65 designers working in Cairo today, producing a variety of designs ranging from architecture to product design and furniture, to also graphic design, and to try to create a community, because given the realities in Cairo today where there is no design entity, there is no design museum. In fact, when the London Design Biennale wanted to invite someone, they didn't know who to go to, so there isn't an obvious representative for the field of design in the Egyptian context. What that also means is that a lot of the designers, despite their aspirations, they really don't have a clear marketplace, but they also don't have a clear communal space in which they can exchange ideas and work together, nor are there opportunities to exhibit and to be critiqued, because part of the process is to show off what you have, and sometimes people love it, sometimes they hate it, and that's actually part of your growth process. So part of the idea of this exhibition was not to sort of present any complicated theoretical idea, more than to just say, we haven't had an exhibition that gathers the current moment in one room, so let's try and do that. And in fact, what happened was the starting of building a community through activities that were related to the exhibition back in Cairo, because of course the reason it happened in Dubai is because they gave me a budget to do an exhibition. I didn't have to do anything, and that's why it happened in Dubai. But of course, I would love to have done something like this in Cairo. But what I did instead is a series of talks where I invited designers and the public to meet and to sort of showcase what they have. And again, part of this idea of building an audience is to create a publication, influenced, of course, by Said Karim's desires to publicize design through print. I know everybody was saying, why would you go print now? Why not just online? Print is what you'll end up having in the archive. Online is ephemeral, and I think it's really. It's really important to really produce physical things that stick around on shelves. And so this was the catalog that was done for the exhibition. Another recent development that I think was really interesting in terms of what ideas, what questions came out of it, was a pop-up display that we did in Cairo as part of the Modern Egypt project, where some of the very initial set of objects that were collected were put on display in a shop front in downtown Cairo with no labels and no sort of, without the authority of a museum telling the public what these things are. Mostly because, again, these kinds of objects that have come out of this history that I've tried to discuss are still seen as mundane and almost as worthless. They're things that we use, they're not things that we look at in museums. Because museums in Egypt are about monuments, they're about unique things, and this is not unique to Egypt, this is what you find in museums all around the world. However, in some places such as, let's say, London, you do have museums such as the City Museum, where you might find garments, where you might find signage, where you might find advertising, where you might find sewing machines. That institutional framework doesn't exist yet in Cairo. So to present these kinds of objects with a very heavy-handed sort of museum framework would have been quite foreboding for people. So the idea was to really invite people to participate, not only in experience and what it's like to look at something that you might have had in your own household or that you might have seen your grandmother use and sort of displayed in this way, but actually encourage people to touch it and to tell stories and to share ideas about what they could potentially mean as historical objects. And it was really quite, I think, exciting to see people's reactions, but also their questions. The very obvious questions were coming out, like, why is this Egyptian? And why is this modern? The very word modern is really quite different when you translate it in Arabic. Hadith means it's new, it's right now. That differentiation between contemporary and modern that we have in English doesn't necessarily work that way in Arabic. So to tell someone that this is modern, when for them it's their grandmother's generation's kind of object, was quite interesting to even linguistically think about how do we frame these items and these objects. Coming up, there should be some sort of display happening soon that you will hear more about here in London. There is also the potential to do something at the London Design Biennale, although unfunded. And then finally, this year there's a publication coming out that I've been working on for the last 2.5 years, which is an architectural guide for Cairo with about 200 buildings, many of which you've seen already. And this is coming out by the American University Press. So Cairo since 900 actually covers the entire city, obviously with a focus on downtown, because it is the area that had the most investment in terms of building activities, but also the one that has been affected least in terms of demolitions and destruction of 20th century heritage. So look out for it, hopefully by the end of this year here in London. And I think I've gone over my time, so thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating kind of insight, a view into a complex world of modernist design in Egypt, and taking us full gamut from the buildings themselves to some amazing architectural journals, and right through to kind of insect repellent.
Yes.
And giving us a kind of insight into your ways of, as you say, building audience for new generation. And really, I'm sure we all look forward greatly to your publication upcoming. And I'd like to kind of abuse my situation, my position, and ask the first question, if I may.
Yes,
as archivist, I'm always really interested in sources. What kind of, do many office archives exist still?
Yeah, so a lot of my research has been based, in fact, on the printed and published material. This is why they feature quite heavily in even the presentation. But in many ways, it's an interesting source because you see the way the maker presented his own work and the way they frame it. And usually that's one of many sources, so you have other sources to corroborate and to sort of compare notes. But it's an interesting kind of history that emerges when all you have is some magazines that are quite rich in terms of material, but are really your only source in many times. In many, with many architects, the only thing we know about them is the couple of buildings they published here and there. However, there are some offices that do have archives that were maintained. Interestingly, Sayyid Karim's own office was burned down in 1952 as part of the Cairo fire.
Oh gosh.
The Cairo fire was an event that sort of led to the 1952 revolution / coup d'etat, in which arson swept the city and many offices and commercial spaces were burned. So, in fact, the archive of the magazine is gone since 1952. But of course, he maintained other things in his house, and that's what ended up at the American University archive. There are a couple of other architects that have shown, like Mahmoud Riyad, whose family continues to practice architecture, and they maintain the archive as well, however, not in great condition. And of course, none of it is digitized or really indexed or organized.
Another funding bit needed.
Yeah, so I mean, in fact, it needs to be worked on. It's just a pile of papers at the moment.
Interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you please talk a bit more about the process of how the architecture was commissioned? I mean, you keep mentioning it was a state role, and I'm sure the central planning must have been very strong. And I just wanted to see whether it was opened up to competition. And by the same token, given how close the system was and how influenced it was by the Russians, you didn't speak very much in terms of Soviet influence and so on. And just one smaller question, if you can address it later. Can you tell us a bit more about the Egyptian pavilion at the Biennale in Venice? And whether it was...
Venice?
Yes, I mean, if you know some background history about the architect and so on. Thank you.
Okay. So I think commission. I mean, architects need someone to pay for their work. Unlike artists, you can't just create. You have to have somebody pay for it in order to realize your work. And so this is why I think Said Karim is quite interesting, because really, in many ways, he's after his ideas as much as he's after clients to pay for his ideas to be implemented. And this is why, while his magazine, when he established it in 1939, opens with a kind of a I don't know how to call it, while sort of maintaining, well, he was really trying to appeal to the king, let's just say. And then after 52, he was very happy to appease the Nasser regime. So again, politically extremely flexible, but it's really about gaining a commission and being the one that gets more opportunities to realize ideas. And so after 52, what happens is the state really dominates in terms of building activities. There are still a lot of private entities that are developing, that are building real estate, but what happens is there's also a developmentalist policy that's nationwide that includes things like culture palaces, housing, schools, and so on. So those are things that need to be done on quite a new scale that was never really seen before, and so the state was quite dominant. And I think the profession of architecture really got hurt. I mean, Said Karim being on house arrest for the last 4 decades, despite all of this history, is only a small I think insight into what happens when professionals try to be too friendly with one particular political entity or another, because the profession really suffered. And I think what you see in Egypt today is a result of this. I mean, architecturally today, Egypt is far from being the hotbed of contemporary architectural design. I don't know how that happened after this in only 50, 60 years. And I think that's what happened. The profession is not independent, and it was not able to really grow in a way that it could have. The Russian influence is quite interesting, because the Russian architects were not in Egypt to build apartment houses. You know, they were there they lived secluded on construction sites that were all about infrastructure, high dam, obviously, electricity infrastructure, oil and gas, and so on. So they were kind of somewhere on the margins, literally in many ways, and they did not participate in this entire scene that I tried to describe, which is very urban and very middle class. This is not where the Russians were. And in terms of publishing, you never see anything in reference to Russian architects in any of these magazines, or any other magazines for that matter. I think the very brief, interesting appearance of Russians with regards to building and development was in Yusuf Shahin's critical film about the High Dam, for which he was exiled. So the Russians are kind of kept silent and invisible, although they were present on the periphery. Yeah.
Hi. You mentioned just then, a little earlier in your presentation, that a lot of this work was geared towards housing, but more towards the middle class and the bourgeoisie. Do you think that significantly affected the way that modernism is held in the modern Egyptian psyche?
The way that?
The modernism is held in the modern Egyptian psyche. Perhaps one of the reasons why it'd be torn down or not respected.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I think what's fascinating to see is the fact that there was a sort of a trickle-down effect during the period. So, for example, the contractors that would build quite a lavish apartment house in an area like Zamalek, which is an very upper-class area, they would go home to Abdeen or Sayyidah Zainab, which are quite popular areas, working-class areas. But you would see that how what they were building for those clients impacted what they were building in those areas as well. So there's a kind of an interesting, kind of conversation happening there. That's also been a topic that's completely understudied because those areas are not seen as sort of sites of interesting architecture, for example. But I do think there is that interesting relationship there. the association with the aspiration for middle class aesthetics is something that continues until today. It's just that the aesthetics have changed. So if the bourgeoisie of today or the nouveau riche of today, they like sort of revivalist plaster columns that look like a Greek temple that says, you know, God bless this house in Arabic in the middle of the pediment. If this is what they're doing in the really fancy neighborhoods, that's what you would see in the informal areas too, kind of with the watered down version where the columns are just smaller and the facades are just obviously much taller to accommodate more people. But you know, this kind of relationship between the haves and the have-nots has kind of been there for the last century, and it's been completely unstudied in terms of how aesthetics are created and how they travel across classes. But I do think there's something there to discuss. Yeah.
To put what you were saying in a wider context, on the list of designers that occurred earlier in your presentation, the name of Wissa Wassef appeared.
Yes.
And we know that Hassan Fathy was working at the same time, but in a very different style.
Yes.
Was there a counterculture going on at the same time?
Sayyid Karim hated Hassan Fathy. In fact, in his archive, in his personal archive that went to AUC, I found a handwritten note by Sayyid Karim on an invitation for a Hassan Fathy event where he curses him. I'm not going to this. And so I have this. I can scan it and post it, you know. But it's so there's clearly an antagonistic relationship there, and you can tell why. I mean, in many ways, I think the reasons for which Sayyid Karim has been forgotten despite the amount of activity that he's done, and Hassan Fathy is extremely remembered, particularly in the West, despite how little he's actually done. It's quite interesting. That should be a question. You know, why do we remember Hassan Fathy but not Sayyid Karim? I think it's because when modernism reached its limits here in Europe, and there was the need to sort of be critical and look back and think, I mean, really the birth of postmodernism, when Kenneth Frampton needed to write a history about, you know, modern design that includes other people for once, you know, so it's not only about Europeans. Now we want to look at, you know, what's happening in India and what's happening in Egypt. What's happening there had to be different, because it was still driven by the Jonathan Jones approach to reading history, which is, oh, well, this looks like what we have, so why should we include him? But Hassan Fathy, oh, look at this interesting mud brick houses, you know, for peasants with domes. Fascinating, let's bring this in. And suddenly we know Hassan Fathy, but nobody really knows Sayyid Karim, despite the fact that the latter had a much, much greater impact on the shaping and formation of architecture, both in cities and in provinces across the country. So Hassan Fathy was there. He had a failed experiment in 1945 with New Gorna, which was already announced as failed at the time. It didn't take much longer. But despite that, he's revered. And I think there's quite a problem there that should be investigated. Wissa Wassef, on the other hand, I admire very much. And yes, he's kind of part of this cohort. He comes slightly after. He sort of develops more in the late 50s, and then he's really shining in the 70s. So it's a bit after the moment that I discussed today. Yeah.
This is more of a speculative question, I guess, but where do you see Egyptian modernism going with the new capital being implemented? I mean, there's a lot of opportunity for architectures, but again, there's no appreciation for the field, I guess. Sorry.
Wow, that's a really complicated question, I think, honestly, because I think part of what I'm trying to do is to actually say that this entire history, you know, Egyptian students today are not learning about this. This is not on the curriculum. And it's, again, the appreciation for this era, and I think it was extremely important for me, not because of its aesthetics, but because it came out really of a revolutionary moment in 1919 that generated a new class that had aspirations, that had ideas, that wanted to implement those and materialize them into things including space. And the fact that that legacy, all of it together, and architecture only being one piece of the puzzle, is not really it's not really studied. It's not really investigated. It's not really, I mean, students would know the big names. They would know Saad Zaghloul. They would know all the, but the big idea that lasted for a good 30 years, what we call the liberal era in Egyptian history, that included all of this design aesthetic and that approach, is not really something that's put in a museum. There are no textbooks created in 2000 or 2000 something, that commemorate this. And this is why it's extremely essential to shed light on this moment, because I do think in terms of design today, we have a total moment of crisis. I mean, I don't know, there's no clear direction in terms of what is an Egyptian building today, except to perhaps go back to a much more watered down version, to that early moment where pharaonic kind of references were the source of influence. So when you look at something like the Supreme Court building, which was done by an architect named Ahmed Mitu, it's a building that is purely postmodern, which is fine. I'm just not a fan of postmodernism, but it's purely postmodern in the sense that it takes pieces that you recognize as being ancient Egyptian, but they actually are not the product of a study of ancient Egyptian architecture. It's almost like a theater set of ancient Egyptian architecture. So it's not, what we saw in the 20s with the reference to ancient Egyptian art, that's based on an academic investment and investigation of what ancient Egyptian architecture was like in order to translate it into something modern. What you see with the Supreme Court type of approach is not that at all. There's no direct correlation between the ancient and then translating it into the modern. So that being said, I think with the lack of a thorough investigation of our own history of modern design, we kind of missed the boat on even having a postmodern moment, even if that was necessary, because I don't think it's the inevitable next chapter. Postmodernism made sense in some places, but it didn't have to happen everywhere, and it didn't happen everywhere. And so, yeah, there's been a kind of this continuous development in the last 30, 40 years that I think leads to a situation where the new capital will unfortunately be kind of a little bit all over the place in terms of its design approach. Yeah.
Can I just say thank you very much, an extraordinary talk. I am embarrassed to say that the architecture tree that you showed from Bannister Fletcher was still very much in use up until the 80s. And just to say for anybody who wants to venture to the library, the new edition of Bannister Fletcher by Cruikshank is excellent and has, I think, got rid of a lot of that baggage. I just wanted to say, thanks to the AA, because your presentation is trying to refocus away from that imperialist history, which is still going on here in London, okay? Here in the AA, over the last year, we've had some phenomenal talks which have refocused this notion of multiple realities. And the whole arrogance that we see of this continuing notion of the authentic and true baton holders of modernism, charging forward. If you just look at the lecture series at the moment at the Royal Academy, it's just loaded with the same old blockbuster stuff, And so you come to Bedford Square to hear these talks and refocus on what is a really much more rich and diverse historical position on modernism. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very kind of you.
I've got a question. You talk about these cultural buildings that were never built.
Yes.
I wanted to know, was that because there was a fear to lose tradition? Or was to lose tradition? Or was that more of a fear of the oppressed capitalism or autocracy that was happening in Egypt?
No, it was just there was no money.
Oh.
Yeah. yeah, that was really it. No, I mean, in fact, I think a lot of this is it's about money. And I think once, because of economic policies that were implemented after 52. What really happened in Egypt after 52, in many ways, the first decade is quite vibrant with interesting production, despite the fact that people went to prisons and people were silenced, and these things happened. That happens on the side. But in terms of cultural production, in terms of architecture and design, there were some really fascinating and rich things that happened. after the 60s and after the total control of the economy by the state, there was a total disaster because the same people that had the money to commission things like these buildings and many others that I didn't show, some of which actually had impact on the scale of villages and towns and cities. I mean, pashas, were not only all bad people that are there to extract capital. Sometimes they built things that were actually for the public good, at least in a certain scale. And once the money was extracted out, that kind of commission was gone. And so the state became the only person. And money was allocated elsewhere, like wars abroad, like in Yemen or something, And so what that meant who cares about a culture palace in Mansoura? That is quite an expensive building that requires kind of sophisticated structures when there's other things on the table. So that's really why. It's really about money. And this is why I think studying modernism in the Egyptian context is interesting, not because it's unique, but because the way it went is different. It wasn't because people hated it and then they said, "Oh, I want my pediments back. I want my postmodernism." It wasn't that. People ran out of money. The professionals were too consumed in pleasing authorities, and the marketplace totally transformed. And this is not the way we learn about how modernism died in certain places.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
for leaving.
Thank you very much.